Let's get to our panel right now. Joining us for more, Gustau Alegret is the U.S. News Director for international news channel NTN 24. Harlan Ullman is a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council, specializing in national security. Gordon Gray is Director of Fiscal Policy at the Conservative American Action Forum, and Joseph Minarik is the Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Gustau, well, let's start with you, and let's look at the shutdown. It only lasted 3 days, but it seems to have caught the world's attention. I mean, it's essentially a domestic issue, isn't it?
It is domestic, but we have to look at how we have arrived here. And it's been weeks of contradictory messages from the president regarding to immigration. Just remember the meeting in the White House 2 Tuesdays ago when Donald Trump said, I'm going to sign the bill of law. And 2 days later, he said something about 3 countries from Latin America and Africa using pejorative words. And also months of distrust and lack of confidence between Democrats and Republicans in Congress regarding to immigration. So the question for me is, in 2 weeks, in 17 days that we have ahead now, are they going to solve all these important and deep differences between both parties and the Republican Party and the presidency?
Well, isn't that the other unique part about the way the U.S. system works, is you don't have a long-term budget here. It's just kind of a can that keeps getting kicked down the road.
And it's a way also to control the other branch of the of the government, right? I mean, democracy in the U.S. works like a balance of power. So Congress is doing its part, and the presidency has to do its own part.
Right. Let's go to Harlan Ullman. He's in our newsroom. And Harlan, if we look at the United States, if we look at the financial power of the United States, its military might, and even its soft power for that matter, when we see a government like this, the world's biggest economy, shut down, what does it do to the standing of the United States in the world?
Well, for the moment, it makes us look ridiculous, but this is a short-term impact. There are 3 broader issues here. First, you have to realize that this campaign is just starting over what's going to happen with the budget and what's going to happen with immigration. This is the first shot in a much more extended campaign. As Winston Churchill said, this is not the end or the beginning of the end. It may be the end of the beginning. This is going to take a lot more time to resolve if it does. Second, the critical issue here is the elections of 2018 and 2020. Both sides are posturing to use these issues to hit the other party over the head with them. And at this stage, there are no winners or losers. As I said, this is just the first shot. And finally, what you have to realize is that this shows that the system of checks and balances, which is the nature of our divided government that was put in place in 1789 by the Founding Fathers, is working the way that they wanted it to. The question is whether or not this system really can survive the 21st century, because you have a government that is in deadlock. I have argued that our government has been largely broken for a very long time because of the polarization of both parties, pushing one farther to the right and one further to the left, which really is not America's mainstream political thinking. And so I think the politics here are far more important, that I don't believe that there's going to be sufficient compromise. There's an absence of civility. And we'll see what happens on February 8th. But my guess is that the politics will become more vindictive as the election grows more closer. And indeed, we're not going to see any kind of a satisfactory resolution of these critical issues. Hopefully, we'll get a budget. But in terms of security, the worst thing, the most damaging thing that can be done to the U.S. military is a continuing resolution. As Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis has said repeatedly, a continuing resolution has done far more damage to the American military than virtually any enemy we've seen in a very long time. And while Congress may pontificate and pledge allegiance to needing a strong defense, unless there's a separate military defense bill, all those pleas are going to be just more words that go into the atmosphere that have absolutely no impact.
Gordon, what is your view on this? I mean, on the one hand, we can look at the shutdown and say, yes, it's an embarrassment for the United States. On the other hand, as Harlan pointed out, it could act as another check and balance.
So it's hard to find fault with anything that the previous commenter said. I agree. I would also agree that it is in many ways just about the 2018 elections. Republicans and Democrats, on the underlying CR that they were debating and Democrats were voting against, didn't have any fundamental objections to the content of that. Instead, it was about matters peripheral to the government funding bill, and those matters are going to be of interest in the 2018 cycle, no question. I think Democrats want to use the DREAM Act as to their political benefit. They thought, you know what, we're going to shut the government down over it and get some political traction, see if it worked. It was all about political posturing, and
Right.
We'll see if they pay a price.
Does that perhaps explain the blame game that started
Absolutely.
immediately?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It had previously been the sort of the common wisdom that if government shutdowns are a poor bargaining tactic, it used to be that's what Republicans would do when they were in the minority. They'd pick a fight over, back in the 90s. I don't even entirely recall. It was just sort of Newt Gingrich's gambit that didn't work. And then we saw the Republican minority shut the government down over the Affordable Care Act. That didn't work. But I think with Trump in the White House, I think Democrats were making the calculation, you know what, maybe we'll give it a shot and see if people just blame Trump because, well, it's pretty easy to pin stuff on Trump. And my sense is that over the weekend, they kind of looked around and got the impression that maybe it isn't quite that simple and that they were going to pay a price and it wasn't worth it. And that's why a lot of people basically voted on the same thing today that they voted against just a couple days ago.
Joseph, you look at the United States economy, the world's biggest economy, a multi-trillion-dollar economy. When we have a shutdown like this, does it hurt the economy?
It does. The duration of the shutdown makes an enormous amount of difference. It is not a good signal to the rest of the world. If we're not operating the trains on time, people who otherwise would be very happy to lend us money might be holding back a little bit. Interest rates are going to be important, increasingly important, as we go forward. The workings of our government with respect to the world economy are worsened. Harlan was right with respect to the Department of Defense, but it's true government-wide. No administrator can run his organization if he doesn't know what his funding is going to be on an annual basis, and in particular, if he's got to shift gears every couple of weeks. Remember, this is not the first continuing resolution we've had this year. This fiscal year began last October, and we have not been able to get appropriations in place. Go back historically. We used to be able to make this system work. There's nothing new in the way this process is set to operate. What's new is that we're failing to make it work. And we don't have, in particular in the Senate, we don't have the bipartisanship that we need to get the 60 votes. It's very rare when one side has 60 seats and can dictate its own way. In the House, we've got a tremendous fracturing. We've got members who are out for themselves, protecting their own seats, which means that they will take the positions that fit with their constituencies. Those positions may be extreme, and you can't get those people together.
Right, and those positions do get very hardened. Is that the main reason, the fact that there is now a Congress, as there's been a Congress for a long time, which is so divided, so polarized?
You probably can go back a quarter of a century, a little bit more, and you had people who argued with each other vociferously during the day and went to the bar and had a drink together at night. I worked in the Congress myself back in the early 1990s, and you could see members from both sides socializing, talking to one another. There was a basis of trust upon which they could operate when things got tough. That has tended to deteriorate over time, and that's what's making it so difficult to get things done.
Gustau?
Yeah, you talk about the economy, but also the prestige of the United States around the world. So this situation is also undermining the credibility of the government and the presidency itself, which in today's world, it's more than necessary. And the U.S. is defuminating its role,
Right.
Allowing other countries to take this role. And sometimes it's not a good idea to leave room for other big countries
Yeah, Gustau, I would measure that prestige in basis points of yield on our bonds, but we're talking about the same thing. I agree with you. It's very serious.
Gustau, this was in part about the immigration debate here in the United States. I want you to take a look at an ad that President Trump released. It's a campaign ad in which he blames the Democrats for being complicit in the shutdown. Let's watch.
President Trump is right. Build the wall. Stop illegal immigration now.
I will break up soon and I will kill more.
Democrats who stand in our way will be complicit in every murder committed by illegal immigrants. President Trump will fix our border and keep our families safe.
So how did this immigration issue become front and center in this division that we're seeing right now?
Well, since Donald Trump launched himself to the presidency,
Right.
to the nomination. I mean, he presents himself as a candidate who wanted to fight Mexicans. And he made no distinction between a Mexican worker or a Mexican illegal immigrant and a Mexican who is illegal and also a criminal, who he put all together in the same basket. So from that moment, immigration and security is one topic, which is not. But in all the messages, and that's one example, and it's unfair, and it's not true. But from the beginning, Donald Trump has made this, and he is managing the public conversation, joining security and immigration, and this is a country of immigrants.
Anand, I think
Yeah.
that's too narrow of a view.
Yeah.
Look, what's happened in America is that Americans, by and large, are afraid of the future. The cost of health care, retirement, education have got to a point where you've got too many families with two working parents. You have a greater disparity between rich and poor. And what's happened today is that fear translated into anger, and that anger has been expressed in outrage. You see that in the Me Too movement about sexual harassment. And Donald Trump caught the wave of this outrage. And it's not so much that it was Trump, it was that the American people are dissatisfied with a government that's broken, that is not providing the services. And what's very interesting and ironic is that if you go back to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the most trenchant line in it reads that when government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and establish a new one. I'm not predicting a revolution, but I am saying that outrage is now the public mood, and that is translated into the very negative politics we see, the extreme lefts and right, and our inability to govern ourselves. Now, whether that can be turned around in the short or the long term, I don't know. This problem is not existential, it's not cancer, but it is a serious bout of the flu, and if we don't fix it, the American dream is going to be more elusive in my mind, and standards of living for the majority of Americans are not going to be able to increase as they have in the past. That's what we really face, and this debate about immigration and the budget are simply symptoms of this larger malaise, a word that Jimmy Carter never used, but I think it applies today to America's social condition.
I'm going to buy half that. I think there is one historical reality, which is when the U.S. economy is performing poorly, we tend to look for somebody else whose fault it is. And it's usually them. Now, who they are is, of course, a matter of question, but we tend to be more negative on trade and more negative on other countries when our economy is weak than when our economy is strong. So right now, we have this animus about immigration and foreigners taking our jobs. The flows of immigration, the net flows of immigration are actually out right now and have been for few years. But the negativity about immigration means that the president says in the appropriations bills that he wants funding for a war, and that pulls in other immigration issues like the Dreamers. So the DREAM Act, DACA, is not really a part of this appropriations process, but because the wall is in there, it pulls in all the other aspects of our immigration policy into this debate. That's
Right.
why we're engaging on that now.
Gordon, we see, I mean, there are issues to be resolved, like the immigration issue. They need solutions. But is the budget being used here as a kind of sledgehammer for people to just stick to their ideological positions on this?
Well, I would say, so to the extent that the shutdown as a negotiating tactic failed, then I wouldn't call it a sledgehammer. Maybe a swing and a miss, a wiffle ball bat, I suppose. We've seen this approach tried and failed just by Republicans in the past. It certainly elevated the discussion about the DREAM Act, probably beyond Capitol Hill and sort of where it had been, at least among some circles. But I think that as you got to the end of when DACA was scheduled to sort of administratively come to an end, that the issue was going to come to the forefront of a lot of people's attention anyway. So I don't think that the shutdown really accomplished all that much. Frankly, it was disruptive. It was wasteful. It may have inspired some debate on immigration now, but it was a debate that we were going to have, we needed to have anyway. Whether or not they actually make progress on that remains to be seen. But in this case, I kind of feel like using the budget as a sledgehammer was sort of a swing and a miss.
But Anand, it's not over yet. The notion of another shutdown is going to be on us by February 8th. These issues have not been resolved. If one had to make a bet, supposing, for example, the Republicans renege on bringing DACA to a vote in the Senate, what happens then? Because you have this distrust throughout both branches of government, it makes the situation very pernicious. And as I said earlier, this is just the beginning. I think we have a long way to go, and I would not be surprised to see this continuing resolution transpire up until the elections. We will see. I hope that doesn't happen because it's the worst possible way to run a government. But the fact of the matter is, this is the first innings of what's going to be an overtime game, I'm afraid.
Gustau, particularly on the immigration issue, what's your view on this? How do you see it unfold? I mean, there's not going to be a debate. Where do you see it going?
Well, the key for me is what the members of the Freedom Caucus, which is this part within the Republican Party, are going to do, and also what special advisors like Stephen Miller in the White House are going to say, if they have something to say. And I assume that, yes, their positions are very strong anti-immigration. So maybe the leadership of the Republican Party and Democratic Party can break a deal in the Capitol, but from there, the future is not that clear, or as clear as it should be.
Gordon, sorry, go ahead.
Just going to add, Gustau mentioned the situation in the House with the Freedom Caucus, and that's telling. We have districts for electoral purposes, and I think Harlan mentioned this earlier. Because of the way we draw our electoral districts, we have districts whose positions on these issues are extreme. You have House members whose priorities are, first, my seat, second, maybe my party. And as a result, you have House members who, in extremely conservative districts with very negative attitudes towards immigration, are going to hold out for an extreme solution. If you believe some of the national polls about the Dreamers, you find numbers in the 80s
89%
of Americans who believe that young people who were brought here before they were of an age when they could make any legal decision deserve to be given a chance to put down their roots to the extent that they haven't already done so. They've gone to high school, they've gone to college, and have an opportunity to live here. But then you have those very conservative districts where the attitude is in the other direction. It's a minority position, but in those districts, it's a majority. And we have an enormous amount of conflict. Those folks those representatives from those conservative districts are not going to want to go along with a national opinion-based solution to this problem. And it's going to be very tough to deal with in the House and even to some degree in the Senate.
Very tough, but Gustau, you talked earlier on about, a deal being made. What would be the compromise here with the Democrats, what they want as far as the Dreamers are concerned, but in return they would have to agree to money for the wall?
Yeah, Democrats don't want to talk about the wall, but they are willing to talk about border security. Right. So they can make a deal with the president, Donald Trump, regarding to some funds in order to make the border, the southern border, more secure. which could be something that they can deliver. And, but the main challenge for Democrats, I don't know if the other members of the panel agree, it's how to keep alive the anti-Trump movement. And we saw those unbelievable marches this weekend, women marches in the US. So they have to keep alive all these people looking at the midterm elections, and at the same time playing with some political risk, playing with the shutdown and showing to the American people that they are strong, even though they don't control neither the House, not the Senate, not the White House. And that's the balance. And at the same time, they have to be stick to the immigration policies, which are more flexible rather than the Republicans.
What do you think, Gordon? I mean, as the situation becomes so politicized now, we're in this kind of continuous election cycle, aren't we?
Yeah, that's I think a function of kind of our modern democracy. There was an allusion earlier that we haven't often seen a single party control the House and have 60 votes in the Senate and then have the executive branch. But we did see that in 2009 and you know, after the election of Barack Obama. Some people still remember that and think, well, that's the only way to legislate. Everybody gets what they want on their party, and you don't actually have to negotiate or legislate. I feel like kind of the classic old school negotiation and legislating just isn't really done anymore. Everybody waits till the next election.
Or go nuclear.
Right, or they blow it up. Right, or they throw a grenade and just see what happens.
Right.
But there's another problem here.
Yeah.
Rationality has really been lost in our system, unfortunately. We talk about, or the president talks about a wall. Has anybody seen a plan for what the wall is, how much it's going to cost, and where that money is going to go?
Yeah, we've just seen
And the fact of the matter
examples
is
of the wall.
it doesn't exist. And so to put up $18 or $20 billion for a plan that so far is diaphanous reflects, I think, the standard or the low standard where American politics has descended. There should be a rational debate over all these issues. But because the parties have moved so much to the extreme left and the extreme right, and there are important but small minority constituencies that have great clout, the fact of the matter is that rationality is being lost, and we're debating on issues over emotion and over politics and over self-interest and ego. And that's probably the worst combination you can have in a flourishing democracy.
Very quickly, Joseph, we could see some of the international response to what is going on in the United States this week at the World Economic Forum. President Trump is going to be there. It's a gathering of international leaders, business people. Is it likely that this could overshadow that?
I'm sure that the president will hear some discussion of this. I'm sure that certain words on the fringes of our dictionaries are going to be mentioned as part of the discussion. We are not playing a leadership role that we should, and it'll be an issue.
And tomorrow in Montreal, there's going to start the 6th round of the NAFTA renegotiation. So we'll see what happens.
We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for. Thanks for being with us.